Have you ever felt like you're caught between worlds?
No, absolutely. It's a really common modern feeling.
Right. Like you're trying to hold on to your values in a culture that just, completely doesn't get you. You're walking into your workplace, or maybe you're just scrolling through your social feed.
And you get that sinking feeling.
Yeah, that visceral sinking feeling that the way you see the world and the way the culture around you operates are just, they're drifting further and further apart.
It is a deeply disorienting psychological space to occupy. I mean, you feel like a permanent resident alien in your own life.
Exactly. You have the physical address, you pay the local taxes, you participate in the civic structure.
But on a fundamental existential level, you just do not belong. And historically, living on the margins of a dominant culture, well, it inevitably forces a choice.
Which is usually a pretty bad choice.
Right. You either assimilate completely just to relieve the social pressure, or you retreat into this bitter, isolated enclave.
And both of those options, frankly, sound terrible. Because you
Yeah.
start to wonder, how do I actually survive this pressure cooker without compromising the core of who I am?
And just as importantly, without becoming an incredibly cynical, angry person in the process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, today's deep dive is going to unpack what is essentially the ultimate survival guide for that exact feeling.
It really is.
And the fascinating thing, the thing that really hooked me when we were prepping for this, is that this guide was penned by someone who failed spectacularly and publicly before he ever figured it out.
We are, of course, exploring the life, the letters, and the really enduring impact of Peter the Apostle.
And I want to promise you right up front, if you're listening,
Mhm.
this isn't just dry ancient history. We aren't, blowing dust off of irrelevant manuscripts here.
No, not at all. This is a masterclass in resilience. It's about maintaining integrity when the whole socio-political machine is actively pushing against you.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Because
Alright.
to really grasp the genius of this survival guide, we first have to understand the deeply flawed man who was credited with it, right?
Yeah. We absolutely do. If we want to understand Peter, we have to completely discard that pristine, stained glass image of a serene saint.
Right. Scrub that from your mind.
We have to start in the mud and the sweat and the fish scales of first-century Galilee.
Let's talk about that reality. Where is he actually from?
So geographically, he was originally from a town called Bethsaida, but he relocated and lived in Capernaum. That's situated on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee.
And he worked in the commercial fishing trade.
He did, but it is crucial to understand what the fishing trade actually entailed in the ancient Roman economy.
Yeah, because we shouldn't picture a solitary philosopher with a fishing pole just enjoying a quiet morning on the water.
Oh, not at all. The Sea of Galilee was a massive economic engine, and Capernaum was a major administrative and commercial hub.
It wasn't a sleepy little village.
No, it was a bustling customs station. It was positioned right on the border of territories controlled by Herod Antipas and his half-brother Philip.
So that means taxes.
Lots of taxes. It was crawling with toll collectors and military garrisons. The fishing industry was highly regulated.
And heavily taxed by the Herodian dynasty, right? Because they were acting as client kings for Rome.
Exactly. You didn't just, throw a net in the water. You had to lease fishing rights. You had to pay tolls on your catch.
Transport taxes too, right? Just to move the salted fish.
Yep, transport taxes. And you had to navigate these tight-knit syndicate networks just to survive.
So he is a blue-collar guy, but he's also essentially running a small business in a completely rigged, extortionate economy.
That's a great way to put it. He felt the constant crushing squeeze of imperial economic coercion every single day.
So when the historical narrative tells us that Jesus called Peter and Peter left his nets, we have to recognize the gravity of that action.
It wasn't just a simple career change.
Right. It was a total reconstitution of his vocation. And honestly, a massive economic risk.
Huge risk. He was severing ties with an entrenched, complex trade in a specific village to become a witness to a radically different kind of authority.
His entire framework of security, his syndicate, his boats, his predictable income, all of it was abandoned for this itinerant movement.
And his narrative arc from that moment of leaving the nets is, well, it's an absolute roller coaster.
It really is. He follows this movement, and he has this massive, bold moment at Caesarea Philippi.
Where he confidently declares that Jesus is the Messiah.
Right, but then literally in the exact same breath, when Jesus explains that the path of the Messiah actually involves suffering and execution, Peter forcefully rejects it.
He tries to correct his own rabbi.
Which earns him a devastating rebuke.
Yeah, get behind me, Satan. Doesn't get much harsher than that.
And then during the Passion narrative, When the political pressure reaches its absolute
Well,
peak.
Jesus is arrested by the state,
Right. Peter denies even knowing him. Not once, but 3 times.
culminating in him cursing and swearing in a courtyard just to save his own skin.
It is a staggering collapse of courage. But then, we get the narrative in John chapter 21.
The restoration by the risen Christ back on a beach in Galilee.
Yeah. What's so fascinating here is how that specific sequence, the profound confession, the catastrophic failure, and then total restoration, how that establishes the foundational theological pattern for Peter's entire life.
We really have to view this through the lens of first century honor and shame culture.
Which was everything back then, right?
It was your most valuable currency. Honor dictated your social standing, your economic viability, your core identity.
So publicly denying a leader who was then executed as an enemy of the Roman state.
That should have been the permanent end of Peter's story. By the brutal metrics of his culture, he should have been entirely discredited.
Shamed and exiled from the movement forever. Because in any other political or religious movement, if the second in command publicly disavows the founder right before the founder's execution.
That guy is out. He is a total liability.
Precisely. The movement would expel him just to maintain its own credibility.
But the Christian narrative subverts that entirely. He is restored.
And that restoration creates a revolutionary model for early church leadership.
It hardwires the idea that repentance and grace, not flawless performance, are the actual prerequisites for authority.
You do not lead because you are invulnerable or perfect.
Right. You lead precisely because you have been broken, humbled, and restored.
This is even baked into his name. He begins as Simon, but he is given the Aramaic title Cephas,
Which translates to the Greek Petros.
literally meaning rock, which honestly, if you read the early narratives, is incredibly ironic.
Highly ironic.
Because the stability implied by the name rock completely contradicts his notoriously unstable, highly volatile actions early on. He is arguably the least rock-like person in the inner circle.
He was impulsive.
I always think of it this way. Peter is essentially the ultimate fail-forward protagonist.
I like that.
He's the guy in high school who confidently marches up to the blackboard, answers the complex calculus equation, gets it spectacularly publicly wrong in front of the entire class.
Right.
But somehow, 30 years later, he is the principal of the school.
That analogy recaptures the dynamic perfectly. But let's push that further. If that student becomes the principal, how does he treat the students who struggle with math?
Oh, that's good. He'd probably be a lot more patient.
Exactly. Peter's personal experience of constantly meeting grace, of failing that metaphorical equation so publicly, it radically shapes his later pastoral tone.
Because he is intimately acquainted with his own cowardice and vulnerability.
So the instructions he later writes to church leaders are completely devoid of authoritarian arrogance.
When he tells elders to shepherd their flocks, he explicitly warns them against being domineering.
Why? Because a leader who knows he only holds his position by the sheer grace of a beachside restoration cannot possibly look down on the people he serves.
His theology of leadership was forged in the furnace of his own humiliation. That makes so much sense.
It really grounds his authority.
And this pattern of failure and restoration didn't just rebuild his internal psychology. It uniquely prepared him to be the public face of a movement that was about to hit some massive, unprecedented growing pains.
Because the movement doesn't stay a small Galilean sect. It explodes.
And Peter has to lead that explosion. He acts as this vital canonical bridge. In the early chapters of Acts, Peter is the principal spokesman.
At the festival of Pentecost, he's the one who stands up in the middle of Jerusalem and preaches.
Which is jarring, because this is the exact same man who, just weeks earlier, was so terrified of the authorities that he cowered before a servant girl in a courtyard.
It's a total transformation. Now he is publicly reinterpreting the ancient Jewish prophets for thousands of people.
He's linking the historical arrival of the Messiah to the future of this new community.
He is providing the essential connective tissue. He acts as the hinge between the localized earthly ministry of Jesus and the sprawling institutional reality of the early church.
But his most challenging role as a bridge wasn't theological, was it? It was deeply cultural.
Yes, he had to bridge the Jewish origins of the faith with its most controversial, scandalous expansion, the inclusion of the Gentiles.
And we see this play out in the watershed narrative of Cornelius.
Yeah.
Now, we can't just gloss over Cornelius as a simple meet and greet.
No, it was a seismic shift.
To a modern ear, reading about a guy going to another guy's house for dinner doesn't sound like a religious revolution. Why was this such a massive scandal?
We have to step into the socio-political reality of a first-century occupied Judea. Cornelius was not just a Gentile.
Right, he was a Roman centurion.
He was a military officer representing the occupying imperial machine that taxed, oppressed, and crucified Peter's people.
Wow. So for a devout, law-abiding Jew like Peter, stepping across the threshold of a Roman soldier's house and sharing a meal with him,
That crossed impenetrable religious, cultural, and purity boundaries. It was an act of profound defilement.
yet Peter receives a vision dismantling those dietary impurity laws, and he goes.
And while he's speaking in this Roman household, he witnesses the Holy Spirit fall upon Cornelius and his family exactly as it had upon the Jewish believers at Pentecost.
It's the ultimate validation.
Exactly. It completely shattered Peter's worldview. He realizes and publicly declares that God shows no partiality.
The gospel is not a localized ethnic religion. It is a global reality.
And then he has to take this incredibly unpopular revelation back to the conservative leadership in Jerusalem.
To defend the inclusion of non-Jews without forcing them to culturally assimilate to the Mosaic law.
It was a very tense geopolitical tightrope.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We just praised him as this fearless canonical hinge. We just talked about him shattering worldviews.
Uh-oh, here comes the pivot.
Yeah, because later on, there's an incident in the city of Antioch, documented in Paul's letter to the Galatians.
Ah, the Antioch incident.
Peter's in Antioch, freely eating with Gentile Christians, totally living out the Cornelius revelation.
But then a delegation of conservative, traditional Jewish believers arrives from Jerusalem people associated with James.
And Peter, the foundational rock, completely caves. He withdraws. He stops eating with the Gentiles to save face with the conservative faction.
It gets so bad that Paul publicly confronts him and calls him out for sheer hypocrisy.
Right. So my question is, if he already learned this lesson with Cornelius, if he's the leader of the church, how is he still making these cowardly, high-profile mistakes decades into his tenure?
This raises an incredibly important question about how we view historical figures and really the nature of early church structure.
We want them to be perfect.
We do. We tend to want our historical heroes to have a moment of enlightenment and then remain flawless forever.
Right.
But human psychology, especially when dealing with deeply ingrained cultural prejudices, it just doesn't work that way. The Antioch incident reveals that apostolic leadership was highly respected, but it was not viewed as infallible or immune to correction.
The rock was still susceptible to the intense pressures of honor and shame.
He feared the disapproval of his peers from Jerusalem more than he valued the theological truth he had already experienced.
He knew the theology, but when the social pressure turned up, he reverted right back to Courtyard Peter, trying to blend in and not cause trouble.
Yes. And the fact that this humiliating confrontation is preserved in the New Testament canon is extraordinary.
It really is. They could have edited that out.
They could have, but it demonstrates that the early church valued the integrity of the gospel message, the absolute equality of Jews and Gentiles at the table, more than they valued protecting the pristine reputation of their chief apostle.
It proves that unity didn't mean silencing dissent or covering up leadership failures.
Peter is not a sanitized myth. He is a man constantly wrestling with his own flaws in real time.
And honestly, that ongoing vulnerability makes him so much more credible to me.
Absolutely.
We have this textual portrait of a dynamic, struggling leader. But to truly grasp the weight of his letters, we can't just look at the theology. We have to ground the legend in the dirt and stones of antiquity.
We have to look at the archaeological reality of the world he was navigating.
Yes. Let's talk about archaeology.
Archaeology is a vital tool here, provided we understand its limitations, of course.
Right. It rarely provides algebraic proof of specific biblical narratives.
You aren't going to find a receipt with Peter's signature on it.
Property of Simon Peter.
Exactly. But what it does brilliantly is materialize the environment. It illuminates the economic and social pressures of the texts.
Take the excavations in Capernaum, for example.
Right. Archaeologists have uncovered a massive limestone synagogue dating to the 4th century. But beneath it, they found the basalt foundations of a 1st century synagogue.
Which confirms Capernaum was exactly the kind of active, structured Jewish settlement the texts describe.
Furthermore, nearby, they excavated what is known as the House of Peter tradition.
This is the domestic housing complex that early Christians supposedly turned into a place of worship, right?
Correct. It began as a standard 1st century courtyard home, But by the second half of the 1st century, the pottery changes.
How so?
Daily domestic wares disappear, and they're replaced by large storage jars. And the walls are plastered over, covered in early Christian graffiti.
And eventually, an octagonal Byzantine church was built directly over this specific room.
Right. Now, does this unequivocally prove that Simon Peter owned the deed to this specific plot of land? No.
But it strongly substantiates an incredibly early, continuous, and localized historical memory venerating that exact domestic site as his home.
Exactly. It shows they cared about this spot very early on.
Okay, let's talk about the boat, because this is my favorite archaeological detail.
The Jesus boat.
Yes, in 1986, there was a severe drought that dropped the water levels of the Sea of Galilee, and archaeologists found a first-century fishing boat perfectly preserved in the mud.
It was an incredible find.
Now, to use an analogy, if I dig up a massive beige 1990s desktop computer, it doesn't mean I found Steve Jobs' personal computer.
Right.
But that beige box tells me exactly what the limitations of the era were. It tells me they couldn't edit 4K video, they were dealing with dial-up internet speeds, and they had to sit at a desk to work. It defines the physical parameters of their lives.
That's a great point.
So how does this boat do the same for Peter?
Squeezing the juice out of that analogy, the boat does exactly that for Galilean fishing. When marine archaeologists examined it, they found it was constructed with mortise and tenon joinery.
Okay.
But more importantly, it was made from 10 different types of wood.
Wait, 10 different types?
Yes. It had been repeatedly patched and repaired over decades.
Which screams economic struggle.
Absolutely. It was owned by people who could not afford to commission a new vessel. They had to keep patching a dying boat just to survive.
That is so telling.
Furthermore, the dimensions of the boat, it was about 27 feet long, tell us it could hold a crew of about 5 to 15 men.
So it wasn't a massive galleon.
No, it was designed for coastal netting, likely using trammel nets, not deep-water ocean sailing.
It paints a vivid, tactile picture of the exhausting, localized blue-collar labor that Peter was engaged in.
It roots the lofty spiritual calling of the Gospels in a world of calloused hands and patched wood.
And the archaeological footprint doesn't just stop in Galilee. It extends all the way to the center of the empire. Let's talk about the Vatican necropolis in Rome.
This takes us from the mud of Galilee to the imperial center of power. Beneath the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome lies a sprawling Roman burial complex,
A necropolis.
dating from the 2nd to the 4th centuries. Now, historical tradition, dating back to the late 1st century, holds that Peter was martyred, specifically crucified upside down in Rome under the Emperor Nero around 64 CE.
And buried on the Vatican Hill near Nero's circus.
Yes. During excavations in the 1940s, archaeologists found a 2nd century memorial shrine known as the Trypaeon of Gaius,
And a wall covered in Christian graffiti.
including a crucial inscription that translates to, "Peter is here within."
And they found bones, right, which sparked a massive debate.
They did. Bones were discovered in a niche near this monument. In the 1960s, Pope Paul VI actually announced that the relics of St. Peter had been identified in a manner considered convincing.
However, among secular historians and independent archaeologists, the positive identification of those specific bones remains highly disputed.
It's still a very active debate.
So if the scientific community is split on whether those are actually his bones, what is the value of the site? Does it matter?
Oh, it matters immensely because of what it proves about historical memory.
Okay.
The existence of the Trypaeon, the location of the necropolis, and the intense, continuous veneration of that specific site substantiate that the early Christian community firmly believed Peter was martyred there.
It anchors the end of his life in the brutal reality of Neronian persecution.
The broader takeaway here is that the New Testament isn't a collection of myths happening in a magical, unspecified realm.
Right. It is historically concrete.
It's a world of heavy taxation, harsh physical labor, and terrifying imperial violence.
And that crushing imperial pressure is the exact crucible in which the letter of 1 Peter was forged.
Which brings us to the actual survival guide.
Let's dive in. 1 Peter.
1 Peter is a masterpiece of pastoral theology. It is addressed to Christians scattered across Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia.
Which is a vast region comprising modern-day Turkey.
Yes, and the context is vital. It is most commonly dated to the early to mid-60s CE, written from Rome. But interestingly, the author doesn't call it Rome.
He uses a cipher, right? He sends greetings from Babylon.
He does.
Why use Babylon? Is it just a secret code to avoid imperial censors?
It is far more profound than just a secret code. Think about what Babylon means historically. Babylon was the ancient empire that besieged Jerusalem, destroyed the original temple, and dragged the Jewish people into a traumatizing exile.
Oh, wow. So by referring to Rome as Babylon, the author is instantly, rhetorically reframing the geopolitical reality.
He is telling these scattered believers, Rome is not the eternal divine authority it claims to be.
It is just the latest iteration of Babylon.
Exactly. It is the current temporary oppressor of God's people. This instantly establishes a psychological framework of exile for his readers.
Before we dive into what that exilic identity means, we have to touch on authorship. Did a Galilean fisherman who grew up patching boats actually write this highly sophisticated, polished Greek letter?
That is the subject of intense academic debate. Many scholars who lean toward conservative or evangelical views accept Petrine authorship, pointing out that the letter explicitly claims to be from him.
But what about the refined Greek?
They resolve that by pointing to 1 Peter 5.12, where the author states he is writing through Silvanus.
Ah, so Silvanus likely acted as an amanuensis.
Right, a highly trained secretary who could take Peter's theological directives and draft them into eloquent Hellenistic Greek.
That makes sense.
On the other hand, a significant portion of critical scholarship argues the text was written later, perhaps in the 70s or 80s, by a disciple or a Pauline-influenced community using Peter's name to address systemic persecution.
But honestly, regardless of where you land on the specific scribe, the intent of the text is universally recognized.
It is designed to fortify believers who are experiencing intense, localized social ostracization, slander, and vulnerability.
And the way he fortifies them isn't by promising them that things will get easier. He doesn't say, hang in there, Rome is about to fall.
No, he does it by redefining their entire identity.
He uses these two massive concepts, parepidemos and eklektos.
Yes. Parepidemos translates to sojourner, resident alien, or exile, and eklektos translates to chosen or elect.
And he jams these two seemingly contradictory concepts together. You are the elect exiles.
He reaches back into the most profound covenant language of the Old Testament, language from Exodus 19 and the prophet Hosea.
Terms like a chosen race, a royal priesthood, and a holy nation.
Exactly. And originally these terms were fiercely exclusive to ethnic Israel. Peter takes them and applies them directly to this dispersed, vulnerable, largely Gentile church in Asia Minor.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, today? I think of it as the ultimate declaration of dual citizenship.
Oh, that's a perfect way to conceptualize it.
It's like you hold a passport for the country you physically live in. You go to work there, you buy groceries, you participate in the civic structure.
But your true allegiance, your primary citizenship, your core identity is rooted in an entirely different, unseen kingdom.
Exactly. And because your primary citizenship is located elsewhere, the way you conduct yourself in your physical country radically changes. Your ethics are dictated by your true homeland.
Which brings us to one of the most difficult and debated sections of 1 Peter, the household codes.
Right. Peter directly addresses slaves, wives, and husbands, giving them specific instructions on how to navigate the deeply unequal Greco-Roman societal structures.
And let's be honest, to a modern listener, reading ancient instructions telling slaves to be subject to their masters or wives to submit to their husbands sounds incredibly jarring.
It sounds oppressive, honestly. Like the text is endorsing human rights abuses.
It absolutely raises critical questions about how we interact with ancient literature. We have to understand the legal reality of the first century Roman household.
Right, the concept of patria potestas.
Yes. The absolute, legally sanctioned power of the male head of the household over everyone else. This often included the power of life and death over slaves and children. In this culture, for a slave or a wife to adopt a different religion than the head of the house,
That was seen as deeply subversive, even a threat to the social order of the empire itself.
So for Pete, does not celebrate this oppression. It does not endorse slavery as a moral good.
Rather, it assumes the inescapable, brutal reality of this hierarchy and offers survival ethics to an embattled minority trapped within it.
So he isn't telling them to start a violent revolution.
Because a violent revolution by slaves or women in the first century would result in immediate mass crucifixion.
It would be suicide.
Exactly. Instead, Peter subverts the system from the inside out by giving moral agency to the marginalized.
He addresses slaves directly as moral agents, which Roman law rarely did. He reframes their suffering through the lens of Christ's suffering. He tells them that enduring unjust punishment is not a mark of their inferiority, but a profound participation in the dignity of Christ, who also suffered unjustly under Roman authority.
That is so powerful. Furthermore, he commands husbands to honor their wives as co-heirs of the grace of life.
Which is huge in a deeply patriarchal culture that largely viewed women as property or vessels for producing legitimate heirs.
Telling a Roman patriarch he must honor his wife as an absolute spiritual equal was a radical structural check on male dominance.
It really was.
It's subversive compliance. He is teaching them how to live out the ethics of the cross within constraints they literally cannot change.
Well said.
But speaking of complex text, we have to talk about 1 Peter 3.1.
Oh, the spirits in prison.
Yes, this is the passage about Jesus going and making a proclamation to the spirits in prison. People build entire wild supernatural mythologies out of this one verse. Sounds incredibly weird.
It is arguably one of the most obscure verses in the New Testament. The text says that Christ, being made alive in the Spirit, went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison who formerly did not obey during the days of Noah.
The historical and theological rabbit holes here are deep.
Very deep.
Wait, I have to push back here. A lot of modern interpretations try to sanitize this by saying, oh, Jesus is just preaching through the spirit of Noah to ancient people. But that completely ignores how weird and supernatural the first century worldview was, right?
You are exactly right, and that is where contextual scholarship is so important. To understand this, we have to look at the Jewish apocalyptic literature that Peter's audience would have known.
Specifically texts like 1 Enoch.
Yes. In that tradition, the spirits in prison are widely understood to be the rebellious angels, the watchers who corrupted humanity before the flood in Genesis 6.
So in this view, Peter is saying that after the crucifixion, the victorious, resurrected Christ descends and announces his cosmic triumph over the demonic powers that have been imprisoned since antiquity.
He isn't offering them salvation. He is declaring victory.
And Peter connects this to Noah because just as God safely navigated Noah through the chaotic, destructive waters of judgment,
God will save these persecuted believers through the chaos of Roman hostility.
which provides a seamless transition into how he talks about baptism just 2 verses later. He says, baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you.
Which, isolated from the context, sounds like a magic spell.
Right, but he immediately qualifies it. He explicitly states that baptism is not the physical removal of dirt from the body. It is not a magical cleansing ritual.
Rather, it is an appeal to God for a good conscience, grounded entirely in the reality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Baptism is the believer's pledge of allegiance. It is the moment you publicly declare your dual citizenship and align yourself with the cosmic victor rather than the corrupt empire.
Precisely.
Okay, so 1 Peter is this brilliant, gritty survival guide for external social hostility. But when you turn the page to 2 Peter, the entire atmosphere changes.
Is a sharp, aggressive pivot.
We move from dealing with an external threat, the empire hating you, to a toxic internal threat.
Yes, Tepi Peter operates in a completely different genre and tackles a different crisis. It functions as a farewell discourse, a testament-style epistle.
And we must be transparent about the scholarship here, right, Thee? 2 Peter is the most heavily disputed document in the New Testament regarding its authorship.
It's the book that gives New Testament scholars the most heartburn.
Why is it so contested?
The reasons are multifaceted. First, the Greek vocabulary and stylistic choices in 2 Peter are drastically different from 1 Peter. It contains numerous hapax legomena.
Which are words that appear nowhere else in the New Testament.
Exactly, and it heavily draws on Hellenistic philosophical concepts. Second, the eschatological situation, the delay of Christ's return, seems to reflect a later generation's anxiety.
And finally, the author refers to Paul's letters as a collected body of scripture, right?
Yes, a level of canonical development that most historians argue didn't exist until well after the historical Peter was executed.
Because of this, a vast majority of critical scholars view it as a pseudepigraphal worker, a text written late in the 1st century or early 2nd century by someone using Peter's name.
That is the consensus among critical scholars, yes.
Let me stop you there because we need to address the elephant in the room. If the vast majority of critical scholars think 2 Peter is essentially ancient fan fiction, how do we engage with it as a serious source of truth without completely throwing our intellectual integrity out the window?
That is the essential tension, and the answer lies in understanding the sociology of ancient literature.
How so?
In the Greco-Roman and Jewish worlds, the concept of pseudepigrapha, or testament literature, did not carry the same stigma of plagiarism or forgery that it does in modern copyright law.
So it wasn't seen as a scam?
No, it was often a recognized literary device, a form of transparent fiction. When a community faced a new crisis after the death of a revered leader, a disciple deeply steeped in that leader's teachings might write a letter in their name.
The implicit understanding was, if Peter were here to face this new heresy, based on everything he taught us, this is exactly what he would say.
Exactly. The early church eventually accepted 2 Peter into the canon, not necessarily because they were duped about its physical penmanship, but because they recognized that the theology it contained faithfully and urgently reflected the apostolic tradition of Peter.
It is an authorized continuation of his theological trajectory.
Yes.
So it's less about a counterfeit signature and more about authoritative continuity. The community recognizes the voice of the founder in the text.
Precisely. And the crisis this text addresses requires an authoritative voice. The structure of 2 Peter is relentless and highly logical.
Chapter 1 establishes the necessity of Christian virtue, grounding the faith in the historical eyewitness memory of the Transfiguration.
And then Chapter 2 is a blistering, visceral attack on false teachers who have infiltrated the community.
And Chapter 3 deals with the profound anxiety surrounding the delayed return of Christ.
Let's dig into Chapter 2. Who are these false teachers, and what exactly are they doing to warrant such an aggressive takedown?
Right, because he does not hold back.
What's fascinating about 2 Peter's polemic is that it explicitly links doctrinal corruption with moral corruption. You cannot separate what you claim to believe from how you behave.
The author uses two key Greek concepts here, epignosis and arete.
Yes. Epignosis meaning deep, mature knowledge of God, and arete meaning moral excellence or virtue.
These false teachers appear to be influenced by early forms of Epicureanism or proto-Gnosticism.
They are claiming a specialized knowledge of grace that they argue frees them from physical moral restraints.
They're using their theology to justify indulging in sensuality, sexual immorality, and exploiting the congregation for financial gain.
They are essentially saying, the rules of the physical world don't apply to our enlightened spirits, so we can do whatever we want with our bodies.
Wow. And the author forcefully argues that true knowledge of Christ inevitably produces virtue.
If your theology leads you to exploit vulnerable people and indulge your most selfish impulses, your theology is objectively false.
To prove this, he points to catastrophic historical precedents. The angels who rebelled, the destruction of the ancient world by the flood, and the incineration of Sodom and Gomorrah.
The argument is clear. God is actively paying attention to history. He absolutely possesses the power to judge systemic wickedness while simultaneously rescuing the righteous, as he did with Lot.
It's a severe, terrifying warning. But then, in Chapter 3, the tone shifts to address a totally different kind of psychological burden.
The believers are looking at their watches.
They're looking at the calendar. Christ promised to return and set the world right, but decades have passed.
And scoffers within the community are actively mocking them, saying, where is this coming he promised? The founders have died, and everything just goes on exactly as it has since the beginning of creation.
It is an intense, communal, eschatological anxiety.
And the response Tabor gives us is one of the most profound theological statements in the New Testament. He explains the delay using the concept of makrotheme,
which translates to patience or long-suffering.
The author frames the delay of the cosmic clock not as absence, impotence, or forgetfulness, but as an expression of divine mercy.
The text argues that God's perception of time is vastly different from ours. 1,000 years is as a day.
He is not slow as humans count slowness. Rather, he is enduring immense patience toward humanity, expanding the window of grace because he does not wish that any should perish.
But the text is also adamant that this window of grace will eventually close. The clock will strike midnight.
It describes the day of the Lord coming suddenly like a thief.
And the imagery is catastrophic.
Yeah.
The heavens passing away with a roar, the heavenly bodies being burned up and dissolved. It sounds like a terrifying cosmic annihilation.
It is terrifying imagery. He's likely drawing on both Jewish apocalyptic language and perhaps even interacting with Stoic concepts of ekpeirosis.
The cyclical destruction of the universe by fire.
But we have to look closely at the theological climax here. Is this total eschatological annihilation, where God just throws the physical universe in the cosmic trash incinerator because matter is inherently bad?
No. The underlying Jewish theology points toward eschatological renovation.
Exactly. The fire is meant to purge and melt away the corruption, the systemic injustice, and the moral rot of the current age in order to reveal what the text calls new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells.
The physical cosmos isn't abandoned. It is violently purified and restored.
And notice the practical application. The author doesn't use this apocalyptic imagery to encourage people to sit on a mountain and set dates for the end of the world.
No, he asks, since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness?
The certainty of a future moral reckoning demands active, holy living in the present tense.
That is the perfect bridge. When we step back and look at the social resilience of First Peter and the doctrinal vigilance of St. Peter together, a massive, unifying theological vision emerges.
It fundamentally redefines human identity and purpose.
The synthesis of these grand themes is where Peter's thought truly shines. If we categorize it systematically, we see a profound theology proper, the understanding of God himself.
Across the material, God is consistently portrayed as holy, sovereign, and deeply patient. He is the active, electing agent who calls a people to himself and preserves them through agonizing trials.
Then we see his soteriology, his doctrine of salvation. It is unequivocally rooted in the sacrificial blood of Christ, resulting in anageneo, which means the new birth.
Salvation in Peter's mind isn't just a legal transaction or a ticket to avoid hell. It is a fundamental existential rebirth into a living, breathing hope.
And what fascinates me most is his Christology, how he explains who Jesus is and what he accomplished. He constantly anchors his understanding of Jesus in the ancient texts of the Old Testament.
He maps the grand redemptive history of Israel directly onto the lived experience of these persecuted first-century churches.
Yes, this is what theologians describe as a cruciform and doxological theology.
Cruciform meaning that it is fundamentally shaped by the pattern of the cross. Doxological meaning that its ultimate goal is the glory and praise of God.
The inescapable pattern in Peter's thought is always suffering first, then glory.
Just as the Messiah suffered unjustly before being vindicated by resurrection, the church must endure unjust suffering before its future vindication.
This is not cheap moralism. He isn't saying, be a stoic, be a good person, and eventually you'll get a reward.
He is saying that by enduring suffering faithfully, you are actually participating in the cosmic reality of Christ.
The way he uses the Old Testament to prove this is brilliant. I want to highlight two specific instances, Isaiah 53 and Psalm 118.
Okay, let's look at those.
In 1 Peter chapter 2, he lifts heavily from Isaiah 53, the famous song of the suffering servant who is pierced for the transgressions of others.
And Peter, applying this directly to Jesus, tells a group of abused, marginalized slaves in Asia Minor, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed.
He is taking the highest, most sacred poetry of Jewish redemption and saying to a Gentile slave, this is your story now. The Messiah's suffering validates and redeems your suffering.
It is a radical democratization of the covenant promises.
And he pushes it even further with Psalm 118. He describes Jesus as the living cornerstone, rejected by human builders, but chosen and precious in the sight of God.
I absolutely love the cornerstone imagery.
I conceptualize it like a massive, unprecedented corporate rebranding, but executed on a cosmic scale.
How so?
Think about the ancient Jewish temple in Jerusalem. It was highly exclusive, geographically localized, guarded by complex purity laws, priests, and animal sacrifices. It was the sole locus of God's presence on earth.
Right.
Peter looks at these scattered, frightened, multi-ethnic believers living in the shadows of the Roman Empire, and he essentially open sources the temple.
That's a great phrase.
He tells them, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house. You are the holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices. He completely decentralizes the sacred. He tells them they don't need a building in Jerusalem to access God, because they are the building.
Open sourcing the temple is a phenomenal way to articulate what is happening structurally. He takes the core exclusive identity markers of ancient Israel and expands them outward to include this globally dispersed, multi-ethnic community.
The historical covenant with Israel is not discarded or replaced. It is fulfilled, exploded, and expanded in the body of the Messiah.
And this theological framework inevitably leads to an eschatology, a view of the end times that is highly future-oriented yet densely ethically charged for today.
The promise of the new heavens and new earth isn't an excuse to check out of society. It is the high-octane fuel required to live a subversive, holy life right now.
And that is exactly where we need to land. Because everything we have discussed, the archaeology, the Greek vocabulary, the ancient theology, isn't just meant to be debated by scholars in tweed jackets in a university library.
Right. It has incredibly sharp, practical teeth for how you and I navigate our lives today.
The contemporary resonance of these texts is striking, primarily because Peter's anthropology, his understanding of human nature, is unflinchingly realistic.
He knows humans.
He knows we are vulnerable, we are driven by fear, we desire social approval, and we are prone to wander when things get difficult.
He lived it in the courtyard of the high priest. He knows how exhausting it is to be the weird one in the room.
Precisely. Therefore, his counsel to people dealing with social displacement isn't a sunny escapist optimism. He never says, just smile, ignore the haters, and eventually you will win the culture war.
He offers a gritty, disciplined, battle-tested, living hope.
The core mechanism of his advice is that identity must precede ethics.
You do not act holy to earn God's favor or to figure out who you are. You act holy because you have already been declared a chosen exile by God.
That secure, immovable identity gives you the psychological and spiritual freedom to practice public ethics in a hostile world.
It allows you to submit to secular authorities without worshiping them, to honor every human being, including your enemies, and to continue doing good even when you are actively slandered and mocked.
And the warnings from 2 Peter feel aggressively relevant right now.
The warnings about false teaching, doctrinal instability, and leaders exploiting the flock.
We live in a hyper-connected, media-saturated age that feels completely destabilized.
If we map Peter's warnings about sensuality, deception, and the exploitation of the vulnerable onto today's digital landscape, the parallels are disturbing.
We are living through a profound crisis of epistemology, a crisis of truth. We inhabit algorithmic echo chambers that financially reward the most extreme, manipulative, and outraged voices.
2 Peter warns us that theological error inevitably distorts ethical behavior.
If you align yourself with teachers, influencers, or politicians who appeal primarily to your basest passions, your worst fears, or your tribal pride, it will invariably corrupt your character.
Doctrinal stability, rooted in the historic truth of Christ, is not an academic luxury. It is a matter of moral and spiritual survival in an age of deceit.
That brings me to my absolute favorite practical application, which comes from 1 Peter 3.15. It's the classic verse on apologetics.
Peter commands his readers to always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you.
But then he adds the vital qualifier, yet do it with gentleness and reverence.
And here is where I struggle. How in the world does that track in our modern internet argument culture?
It doesn't.
Because the algorithm rewards the exact opposite. Social media rewards outrage, dunking on your opponents, triumphalism, and utterly destroying someone in the comment section. Gentleness gets you ignored.
It doesn't track with the algorithm at all. And that is exactly Peter's subversive point. To engage a hostile culture with genuine gentleness and reverence, especially when that culture demands outrage and reciprocated cruelty, is a profound act of nonconformity.
It is the defining conduct of an exile.
If you attempt to defend the gospel by utilizing the empire's weapon slander, mockery, coercion, and cruelty, you have already lost your identity. You have become Babylon to defeat Babylon.
Peter insists that the truth of the gospel must be defended using the character of the gospel.
Gentleness is not passivity or weakness. It is immense strength placed under control. It is a posture grounded in the absolute quiet confidence that Christ has already won the ultimate cosmic victory, freeing you from the desperate need to win the immediate argument.
That is incredibly challenging. It goes against every defensive tribal instinct I have when I feel threatened or misunderstood.
It takes immense practice.
But ultimately, when you pan back and look at the totality of Peter's life in these letters, they prove something beautiful. They prove that you don't have to be perfect to be profoundly useful to God.
And you don't have to possess political power to be deeply historically impactful.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We started on a sweaty, heavily taxed, patched-up fishing boat in Capernaum with a volatile guy named Simon.
We watched him fail the biggest moral test of his life, only to be gracefully restored on a beach.
We saw him evolve into a canonical bridge, shattering his own cultural prejudices to expand a Jewish movement to the Gentile world.
We dug into the first-century mud to examine the archaeological reality of his harsh world.
And we unpacked how his letters fundamentally redefine suffering, establish an unbreakable identity as elect exiles, and provide a gritty, living hope that has sustained millions of marginalized people across centuries.
We've discussed in depth how Peter's theology provided a crucial survival guide for believers who were pushed to the absolute margins of the Roman Empire. Then as we close, here is something to mull over on your own. If Peter's theology suggests that suffering, exile, and social displacement are actually the very mechanisms that refine and authenticate our identity, How might a period of intense cultural marginalization or simply feeling profoundly misunderstood in your own life today actually be the necessary catalyst for the next major evolution of your own character? What if the wilderness you find yourself in isn't a punishment but a preparation?
That is a lot to think about. Remember, the next time you feel caught between worlds like the rules have changed and you're just looking at muddy waters, you aren't the first to feel that way. You are just learning how to be an exile. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep learning, and we will catch you next time.